January 7, 1945, Chabua Airfield, Assam Province, India. Major William Turner's hands moved methodically across the operations board, marking aircraft as they reported landing in Kunming, China. The routine had become grimly familiar over 18 months of hump operations. Planes departed, fought the Himalayas, and either arrived or didn't. But this morning was different. 15 aircraft had departed Chabua, Jorhat, and Sukarating between 1800 hours on January 6 and 0200 hours on January 7. By 800 hours, none had reported to Kunming operations. Not delayed, not diverted, simply gone. This cannot be weather alone, Turner thought, staring at the empty columns. 15 aircraft in 8 hours. The teletype chattered to life. Kunming operations reporting. C-47 411889-2 crashed coordinates 25.4 N 98.7 E. No survivors. C-46 4477531 located burned wreckage 40 miles north Myitkyina. Crew fate unknown. C-47 4223456 reported ice accumulation. Last transmission 2147 hours, no further contact. The reports continued through the morning. Flight Officer Murray Scott, who had battled his own C-46 through the storm and survived, described hearing desperate radio calls. "I seem to be lost, and there's 6 inches of ice on my control surfaces." Then silence. Lieutenant Thomas Sykes, whose C-47 had flipped completely inverted before he regained control, reported watching his altimeter spin downward while hanging upside down in his safety belt, certain he would die. By noon, the accounting was complete. 15 aircraft destroyed or missing. 18 crew members dead. 9 passengers killed. Some crews had bailed out and were walking through Naga headhunter territory toward rescue. Others had simply vanished into cloud banks over the Santsung Range and would never be found. Major Turner stared at the final tally. The hump operation had experienced bad nights before. 3 aircraft lost, 4 aircraft lost, but never anything approaching this scale of catastrophe. In 24 hours, a single weather system had killed more American airmen than most bombing missions over Germany. And the terrible mathematics confronted him. This wasn't combat. No Japanese fighters had intercepted these aircraft. No anti-aircraft fire had brought them down. The enemy was ice, wind, mountains, and the brutal fact that the United States Army Air Forces was operating transport aircraft far beyond their design limitations, over the most treacherous terrain on Earth, with pilots flying twice the hours modern safety regulations would allow. The January 6-7 disaster would become the single worst day in the Hump Airlift's history. But it was merely the most concentrated example of a truth that commanders already knew but rarely stated publicly. The hump operation was bleeding America white in aircraft and men, to keep China in a war that many questioned was worth the cost. The journey to this revelation, to understanding how the United States came to operate the most dangerous supply line in military history, had begun 3 years earlier, when Japan severed China's last connection to the outside world. The crisis began on March 8, 1942. Japanese Imperial Army forces captured Rangoon, Burma, severing the Burma Road, the 717-mile supply route that connected Lashio, Burma, to Kunming, China. For Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist forces already struggling against the Japanese invasion that had begun in 1937, the loss was potentially catastrophic. Without the Burma Road, China had no land connection to Allied supply sources. Without supplies, Chinese resistance would collapse. If China fell, Japan could redeploy the 1 million soldiers committed to the China theater to other fronts. President Franklin Roosevelt, recognizing the strategic necessity, declared on April 2, 1942, that the pathway to China be kept open at all costs. With the land route closed, only one option remained: air transport over the Himalayan mountain range. The proposal bordered on the impossible. The route from Assam province in northeastern India to Kunming, China, measured 520 miles, but those 520 miles included the 15,000-foot Santsung Range, extreme weather patterns where Himalayan storms collided with Indian monsoons, zero reliable navigation aids, and no emergency landing sites between departure and destination. Aircraft would have to fly at altitudes exceeding their designed cruising ceiling, through weather that would ground commercial aviation without the ability to turn back once committed. Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commanding U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater, opposed the plan. The mathematics were unforgiving. Available transport aircraft could carry minimal payload at the required altitudes. The C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the Douglas DC-3, carried 4,000 pounds of cargo at 10,000 feet cruising altitude. At 15,000 feet, payload capacity dropped to approximately 2,500 pounds. Fuel consumption increased dramatically at high altitude. The round trip from Assam to Kunming consumed most of the aircraft's range, leaving minimal safety margin. But strategic necessity overruled logistics concerns. In May 1942, the 10th Air Force activated the India-China Ferry Command with 27 modified C-47s and C-53s. Colonel William D. Old, commanding the Assam-based ferrying operation, received orders to deliver 100 tons monthly to China. The operation began on May 8, 1942, when Captain Weldon O. Ball flew the first transport mission from Denjon, India, to Kunming, carrying gasoline, ammunition, and small arms. The initial flights revealed the operation's fundamental challenge: the mountains. The Santsung Range, running roughly north-south between India and China, forced aircraft to climb to 15,000 feet minimum altitude. But weather frequently required 17 to 20,000 feet to clear turbulence and icing conditions. The C-47, with a service ceiling of 24,000 feet, operated near its maximum capability. Pilots calculated fuel consumption constantly, knowing they lacked reserves for extended diversions. The first casualty occurred on May 22, 1942. C-47 417626, piloted by Lieutenant Abner M. Brady, departed Denjon for Kunming at approximately 0930 hours. The aircraft carried 3,000 pounds of ammunition and 3 passengers. At approximately 11:45 hours, ground observers reported hearing aircraft engines in clouds over the Santsung Range, followed by an explosion. Search aircraft found wreckage at 14,200 feet elevation on the mountain's eastern slope. No survivors. Lieutenant Brady's death established the pattern that would repeat throughout the operation: experienced pilots, functioning aircraft, routine cargo, and sudden, catastrophic encounters with weather or terrain that left no chance for survival. By August 1942, the India-China Ferry Command had expanded to 62 aircraft and was delivering approximately 85 tons monthly, still far below requirements. Chiang Kai-shek's forces needed 10,000 tons monthly to sustain combat operations. The gap between requirement and capability drove increasingly desperate measures. The first organizational response came in December 1942, when the Air Transport Command assumed control of the operation from the 10th Air Force. Brigadier General Earl Hardin, commanding the India-China Wing of Air Transport Command, received orders to increase deliveries to 5,000 tons monthly by March 1943. The mission designation changed officially. Hump Operations, named for the Himalayan mountain barrier aircraft crossed on every flight. Hardin's solution was scale and standardization. More aircraft, more pilots, more bases, standardized routes, mandatory procedures. By March 1943, the India-China Wing operated 142 aircraft from 4 major bases: Chabua, Sukherating, Jorhat, and Dinjan in Assam. Monthly tonnage reached 2,700 tons. Better, but still insufficient. The expansion revealed another critical problem. The C-47 was fundamentally wrong for the mission. At 15,000 feet, carrying only 2,500 pounds of payload, each C-47 consumed 1,200 pounds of fuel to reach Kunming, leaving 1,300 pounds of cargo actually delivered. The efficiency was abysmal. China needed aviation gasoline, which weighed 6 pounds per gallon. Each C-47 delivered approximately 215 gallons while consuming significantly more for the round trip. The solution arrived in March 1943, the Curtiss C-46 Commando. Larger than the C-47, with two 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, the C-46 could carry 10,000 pounds at 25,000 feet. The higher service ceiling meant the C-46 could fly over weather that trapped C-47s. The increased payload meant better efficiency. But the C-46 brought its own catastrophe. The aircraft's fuel system design featured wing-mounted tanks with fuel lines running through the wing route. The connections leaked. Aviation gasoline pooled at the wing route inside the fuselage. One spark from electrical systems, static discharge, or engine backfire, and the pooled fuel ignited. The C-46 became a fireball. The explosions happened without warning. C-46 447712, piloted by Lieutenant Robert Parsons, departed Chabua on June 14, 1943 at 14:20 hours. At 14:47 hours, Parsons radioed, experiencing fuel system problem, returning to base. At 14:49 hours, ground observers saw the C-46 trailing fire from the wing route. At 14:50 hours, the aircraft exploded in midair. No survivors. Pilots began calling the C-46 the flying coffin. Despite the casualties, the C-46 delivered results. By July 1943, monthly tonnage reached 3,000 tons with 160 aircraft operating. But casualties mounted proportionally. July 1943 saw 12 aircraft destroyed and 23 crewmen killed. August brought 15 aircraft lost and 31 dead. The mathematics were brutal. Approximately 1 aircraft destroyed for every 250 tons delivered. General Stilwell, observing the carnage, wrote to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, "The air ferry is bleeding us white in transport airplanes. We are losing aircraft faster than we can replace them. If this continues, it may cost us an extra winter in the main theater of war." But the operation continued to expand, because the alternative, abandoning China, was strategically unacceptable. Through late 1943 and into 1944, the Hump operation evolved into a massive aerial conveyor belt that defied every principle of aviation safety. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic, predictable danger that crews faced on every mission. Weather killed consistently. The meteorological conditions over the Himalayas combined the worst elements of mountain flying with tropical storm systems. Indian monsoons, running from May through October, brought sustained heavy rainfall, zero visibility clouds, and severe turbulence. Winter months brought equally deadly conditions: extreme cold, unpredictable wind shear, and ice accumulation that added thousands of pounds to aircraft wings and clogged carburetor intakes. Ice was particularly insidious. Supercooled water droplets froze instantly upon contact with aircraft surfaces. A C-47 flying through icing conditions could accumulate 500 pounds of ice on wings and control surfaces in 15 minutes. The additional weight degraded lift, increased stall speed, and reduced control authority. Pilots fought aircraft that gradually became unflyable. Captain James Mitchell described the experience in a report dated November 12, 1943. Ice formed so rapidly, I watched the wing leading edge change shape. The aircraft began vibrating. Airspeed dropped from 145 miles per hour to 90 miles per hour in 5 minutes, despite full power. I descended immediately, trading altitude for airspeed, and broke out of icing conditions at 11,000 feet. The ice was 4 inches thick on the wing. We were 50 miles inside Japanese-controlled Burma and too low to return to India. We flew to Kunming at 10,000 feet. The ice didn't melt until we were on the ground. Mitchell was lucky. C-47 42-2389, piloted by Lieutenant Theodore Walsh, encountered similar icing conditions on December 3, 1943. Walsh never reported reaching Kunming. Search aircraft found wreckage 3 weeks later at 13,800 feet elevation. The investigation concluded ice accumulation had exceeded the aircraft's ability to maintain altitude. Wind created equal danger. Himalayan weather patterns generated jet stream winds exceeding 200 miles per hour at altitude. Pilots computed ground speed constantly, calculating whether they had sufficient fuel to reach destination. The math were unforgiving. A C-47 cruising at 150 miles per hour airspeed into a 100-mile headwind made 50 miles per hour ground speed. The 520-mile journey consumed 10 hours and 20 minutes, longer than the aircraft's fuel endurance. Lieutenant Paul Johnson, flying C-47 42-3284 on January 15, 1944, encountered headwinds exceeding his calculations. At 90 minutes from Kunming, with insufficient fuel remaining, Johnson radioed, "Cannot reach destination. Fuel state critical. Attempting emergency landing." Ground stations never received further transmissions. Wreckage was never located. Wind created equal danger. Himalayan weather patterns generated jet stream winds exceeding 200 miles per hour at altitude. Pilots computed ground speed constantly, calculating whether they had sufficient fuel to reach destination. The mathematics were unforgiving. A C-47 cruising at 150 miles airspeed into a 100-mile headwind made 50 miles per hour ground speed. The 520-mile journey consumed 10 hours and 20 minutes, longer than the aircraft's fuel endurance. Lieutenant Paul Johnson, flying C-47 42-3284 on January 15, 1944, encountered headwinds exceeding his calculations. At 90 minutes from Kunming, with insufficient fuel remaining, Johnson radioed, "Cannot reach destination. Fuel state critical. Attempting emergency landing." Ground stations never received further transmissions. Wreckage was never located. Turbulence exceeded anything pilots had experienced in training. Downdrafts dropped aircraft 2,000 feet in seconds. Updrafts slammed aircraft upward with forces exceeding structural limits. C-46 44-7823, flown by Captain Ronald Davis, entered severe turbulence over the Santsung Range on March 8, 1944. Davis reported, "Turbulence threw us inverted, broke through cloud layer upside down, rolled back to level flight. Vertical stabilizer shows buckling damage." Davis reached Kunming, but the C-46 was written off due to structural failure. The terrain itself offered no mercy. The Himalayan peaks and foothills provided no emergency landing sites. Aircraft suffering mechanical failures faced impossible choices: bail out over hostile territory or attempt to reach destination on failing engines. Neither option offered good survival odds. The Naga headhunter tribes controlled much of the territory below the southern route. Crews bailing out faced uncertain reception. Captain John Blackie Porter, establishing the search and rescue operation in July 1943, negotiated agreements with Naga chiefs to protect downed airmen. The agreements generally held, but crews walking out through Naga territory faced weeks of jungle travel, tropical disease, and marginal food supplies. CBS correspondent Eric Severeid experienced this firsthand. On August 2, 1943, C-46 44-7731 suffered catastrophic engine failure at 18,000 feet over the Naga Hills. Pilot Lieutenant Colonel Felix Phillips ordered bailout. 21 passengers and crew bailed out successfully. Severeid, landing in dense jungle 60 miles from any Allied base, spent 17 days walking through Naga territory before Porter's rescue team located him. Severeid lost 30 pounds and contracted multiple infections, but survived. Others were less fortunate. First Lieutenant Robert Seastrom bailed out from C-47 42-2357 on October 14, 1943, after both engines failed. Seastrom's parachute was observed from other aircraft, confirming successful bailout. Ground search teams never found him. He was declared missing, presumed dead, on November 15, 1943. By November 1943, the pattern was established. Approximately 4% of missions ended in aircraft destroyed and crews killed or missing. 4% sounds manageable until calculated against mission tempo. With 200 aircraft flying twice daily, 4% meant 8 aircraft lost per week, 32 per month, nearly 400 annually. The Air Transport Command's response was to fly more missions. Monthly tonnage demands continued increasing. By January 1944, requirements reached 10,000 tons monthly. By July 1944, 15,000 tons. Each increase required more aircraft and more pilots flying more missions into the same deadly conditions. Pilot rotation policy attempted to limit exposure. Initially set at 650 flight hours, commanders increased the requirement to 750 hours after pilots began reaching rotation too quickly. At 750 hours, flying standard hump missions averaging 6 hours round trip, a pilot completed 125 missions before rotation, approximately 6 months of constant flying at twice daily mission rates. But the mathematics of attrition caught pilots before rotation. Captain Douglas Henderson, arriving at Chabua in March 1944, flew 89 missions totaling 534 hours before his C-46 disappeared over the Santsung Range on August 17, 1944. No distress call, no wreckage found. Henderson was 23 years old. The pattern repeated across the theater. They lost aircraft at Chabua. They lost aircraft at Jorhat. They lost aircraft at Sukarating. They lost aircraft departing Kunming for return flights. The hump consumed aircraft and crews with mechanical regularity, and the operation's expansion meant the absolute numbers grew despite improving procedures. But the pattern that commanders found most disturbing was this: experienced pilots died at nearly the same rate as new pilots. Experience helped with navigation and weather avoidance, but experience couldn't eliminate the fundamental danger of operating underpowered aircraft at excessive altitude through Himalayan weather. The danger was systematic, not individual. Colonel Thomas Hardin, arriving to inspect hump operations in May 1944, wrote in his report, "This is not a transport operation. This is a combat operation where the enemy is weather, terrain, and aircraft operating beyond design limits. Casualty rates rival bomber operations over Europe. But bomber crews receive combat recognition. Transport crews receive nothing. They die anonymously. The pattern had emerged with brutal clarity. The hump operation worked only through accepting losses that would be unacceptable in any peacetime context. And the operation was about to get significantly worse. November 15, 1943, marked a fundamental shift in hump operations. On that date, Japanese fighters attacked transport aircraft for the first time, proving that even the most dangerous supply line could become deadlier. The attack occurred at approximately 13:15 hours. 6 C-87 Liberator Express transports, converted from B-24 bombers, flew in loose formation at 22,000 feet approaching Kunming. The C-87s cruised higher than C-47s or C-46s, believing altitude provided safety from Japanese fighters operating from airfields at Myetkina, Burma. The belief proved wrong. 12 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters intercepted the formation at 22,500 feet. The C-87s, unarmed, lacked defensive weapons. The attacks lasted approximately 8 minutes. 3 C-87s went down immediately. C-87 41-23723 exploded after the first fighter pass, killing all 5 crew members instantly. C-87 41-23801 suffered catastrophic wing damage, entered inverted spin, and disintegrated before crew could bail out. C-87 41-24192 sustained engine fires, descended rapidly, and crashed 40 miles southwest of Kunming. The 3 surviving C-87s scattered, diving for cloud cover. 2 reached Kunming with battle damage. 1 disappeared. The pilot apparently flew the wrong direction, fleeing the fighters, and ran out of fuel over unoccupied territory. The November 15 attack killed 18 American airmen and destroyed 4 aircraft, making it the second deadliest single day in hump operations to that date. But the strategic implications exceeded the immediate casualties. Japanese fighters had proven they could intercept transport aircraft at any altitude on the Kunming approach. The Air Transport Command responded by routing transports north, adding 80 miles to each mission to avoid known Japanese fighter ranges. But Japanese forces operated approximately 100 fighters from forward bases throughout Burma, and their operational radius extended across most of the hump route. Fighter attacks continued through 1944. January 8, 1944 brought another massacre. 7 C-46s approached Kunming at 18,000 feet when 16 Ki-43 fighters intercepted. The C-46s, carrying primarily ammunition and fuel, exploded when hit. 4 aircraft destroyed, 12 airmen killed. February 23, 1944, 3 C-47s destroyed, 9 killed. April 12, 1944, 5 C-46s destroyed in a single engagement, 15 dead. The casualties forced policy changes. Beginning in May 1944, fighter escorts accompanied transport formations when available. But fighter escort required P-38 Lightning or P-51 Mustang fighters with sufficient range to reach Kunming, and fighter assets remained scarce in the theater. Most transport missions flew unescorted. The alternative was defensive armament. In June 1944, Air Transport Command authorized mounting .50 Euro caliber machine guns in C-46 cargo doors. The modification required removing approximately 800 pounds of cargo to accommodate the gun, ammunition, and gunner. The guns provided marginal protection. Transport aircraft couldn't maneuver like fighters, and a single .50 gun facing rearward offered limited defensive coverage. Lieutenant Raymond Shaw, flying C-46 447789 with door gun installed, described engagement on July 18, 1944. 2 Oscars made stern attack. Our gunner fired approximately 200 rounds. Uncertain if hits achieved. Oscars broke off after 3rd pass. We sustained wing damage but reached Kunming. The defensive gun possibly deterred the fighters, or possibly the Japanese pilots simply expended ammunition and departed. Shaw couldn't determine which. What pilots did know with certainty, the defensive guns killed Americans. The .50 caliber machine gun ammunition stored near the cargo door occasionally detonated when Japanese rounds struck the aircraft. C-46 4478456, attacked on September 3, 1944, suffered ammunition detonation that blew out the entire cargo compartment. The aircraft disintegrated. All 5 crew members died. But fighter attacks, deadly as they proved, killed fewer Americans than the operation's fundamental design flaws. Flaws that became impossible to ignore as the operation scaled to unprecedented size. In August 1944, Brigadier General William Tunner assumed command of the India-China Wing. Tunner, who would later command the Berlin Airlift in 1948 to 1949, brought systematic efficiency to hump operations. He standardized procedures, improved maintenance, established strict scheduling, and pushed pilots to fly more missions faster. Tunner's efficiency increased tonnage dramatically. September 1944 deliveries reached 24,000 tons. October brought 28,000 tons. But the price was paid in pilot exhaustion and maintenance shortcuts. The pilot rotation policy, still set at 750 hours, took longer to achieve as individual mission hours decreased due to improved procedures and better aircraft. Pilots flew 2,000 hours annually, twice the 1,000 hours FAA regulations allow modern airline pilots. They flew consecutive missions with minimal rest. They flew through weather that modern aviation would never approach. And they died with increasing frequency. December 1944 casualties reached 35 aircraft destroyed and 67 crewmen killed, the highest monthly losses to date. January 1945 began with similar numbers. 8 aircraft lost in the first 5 days, 19 crewmen dead. Then came the night of January 6-7, 1945. The weather system had been tracked developing over the Bay of Bengal for 3 days. Meteorology forecasts predicted severe icing, turbulence, and winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. But Tunner's scheduling system prioritized tonnage delivery. Missions flew unless conditions absolutely prohibited takeoff. 15 aircraft departed between 1800 hours January 6 and 0200 hours January 7. All encountered the storm front over the Santsung Range. Ice accumulated faster than pilots had experienced. Winds exceeded 180 miles per hour, reducing ground speed to below 50 miles per hour in some cases. Gale force turbulence exceeded aircraft structural limits. Lieutenant Thomas Sykes, piloting C-47 422395, described the experience. Ice formed immediately crossing the range. I climbed to 19,000 feet, attempting to get above icing level. The aircraft wouldn't climb higher. Airspeed dropped to 85 miles per indicated. Then severe turbulence hit. The aircraft rolled inverted. I was hanging in my safety belt with dirt from the floor falling around me. I thought we were dead. Sykes fought the controls, managed to roll level, and descended rapidly to break out of icing conditions. He reached Kunming with the aircraft structurally damaged but flyable. Most crews weren't as skilled or lucky. Flight Officer Murray Scott, monitoring radio frequencies, heard desperate calls. I seem to be lost and there's 6 inches of ice on my control surfaces. Silence. Another voice. Both engines failing, can't maintain altitude. Silence. We're going down, coordinates approximately static. By dawn January 7th, operations staff knew the disaster scope. 15 aircraft were missing. Through the morning, scattered reports arrived. Wreckage sighted, no survivors. Parachutes observed, crew fate unknown. Aircraft found burned, all aboard killed. The final accounting, 15 aircraft destroyed, 18 crew members dead, 9 passengers killed. Some aircraft had crashed into mountains. Others had spun into valleys. Several had simply disappeared, blown off course by winds, their final locations never determined. The January 6-7 disaster forced confrontation with a truth that commanders had avoided acknowledging. The Hump operation sacrificed men and aircraft at a rate approaching frontline combat operations, yet received none of the resources, recognition, or strategic priority accorded to combat units. General Tunner, writing his report on the disaster, stated, "These casualties were not unavoidable acts of God. They were the direct result of operating transport aircraft beyond safe limits to meet tonnage demands that could not be achieved within safety margins. We are killing pilots through exhaustion and aircraft through excessive utilization. This must change." But it didn't change. The strategic requirement, keeping China supplied, overrode safety concerns. The operation continued expanding through spring 1945, reaching peak efficiency and peak casualties simultaneously. The turning point wasn't that the operation became less dangerous. The turning point was the realization that the danger was inherent and would never be eliminated. The only choice was whether to continue accepting the casualties or abandon China. Roosevelt, then Truman after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, chose to continue. The journey to understanding why the Hump operation proved so deadly required examining not just individual accidents, but the fundamental design philosophy that made disaster inevitable. The philosophy originated in April 1942 with Roosevelt's directive: China must be kept in the war. Everything else followed from that imperative. The initial requirements specified 10,000 tons monthly delivery to China. The Air Transport Command's planning staff calculated what this required: approximately 166 C-47 flights daily, 4,980 flights monthly, assuming each C-47 delivered 2,000 pounds at 15,000 feet altitude. This required 166 aircraft operating with perfect serviceability. Impossible. Accounting for maintenance, the requirement increased to approximately 250 C-47s. But 250 C-47s didn't exist in the China-Burma-India theater. The entire U.S. military transport fleet in 1942 comprised approximately 500 C-47s and C-53s, distributed globally. Allocating half to the Hump operation was strategically impossible. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve 10,000 tons monthly delivery with available aircraft, each aircraft had to carry maximum payload on every mission, fly maximum missions daily, and operate with minimum maintenance intervals. These requirements existed in direct opposition to aviation safety principles. Colonel Caleb Haynes, assigned to develop the operational plan in May 1942, wrote, "We are being asked to perform sustained heavy airlift operations with aircraft designed for commercial passenger service on routes with prepared landing fields every 200 miles. We will be flying over the most hostile terrain on Earth with no navigation aids, no weather reporting, no emergency landing sites, and no rescue capability. Every fundamental safety principle will be violated. casualties will be severe. Haynes was overruled. Strategic necessity trumped safety concerns. The aircraft selection revealed the impossible compromises. The C-47, proven reliable in commercial service as the DC-3, was designed for 10,000-foot cruising altitude with 10,000-pound payload. At 15,000 feet, payload dropped to 4,000 pounds and engine performance degraded significantly. The aircraft was being operated beyond its designed envelope on every mission. The C-46 Commando offered better performance, 10,000 pounds at 25,000 feet, but had been rushed into production with inadequate testing. The fuel system design, featuring wing root fuel lines, was known to leak. Curtiss Wright, the manufacturer, had reported this to the Army Air Forces in June 1942. The Army Air Forces accepted the aircraft anyway, because alternatives didn't exist. Major Harold Harris, engineering officer at Chabua, examined a C-46 after a fuel system fire in August 1943. His report detailed the fundamental flaw. Fuel lines pass through the wing root inside the pressurized fuselage. Connections are not sealed adequately. Aviation gasoline leaks into the fuselage at the wing root, pooling in low points. Any ignition source, electrical spark, static discharge, engine backfire transmitted through airframe, ignites the pooled fuel. The resulting fire is catastrophic and immediate. Harris recommended grounding all C-46s until the fuel system was redesigned. His recommendation was denied. The C-46 was essential to meeting tonnage requirements. Pilots would simply have to accept the risk. The decision was deliberate, not accidental. Army Air Forces commanders knew the C-46 was dangerous. They chose to operate it because the alternative, failing to deliver sufficient tonnage to China, was strategically unacceptable. This was the fundamental philosophy. Mission success justified any casualty rate. The pilot rotation policy exemplified this philosophy. Initially set at 650 flight hours, the policy seemed reasonable, approximately 108 missions at 6 hours per mission. But pilots flew twice daily when mission requirements demanded, reaching 650 hours in 4 months rather than 6. The Air Transport Command's response wasn't to reduce mission tempo, but to increase rotation requirement to 750 hours. Captain Douglas Mitchell, flying hump missions from March through July 1944, calculated his monthly flight time: 180 hours in March, 190 hours in April, 210 hours in May, 185 hours in June. He reached 750 hours rotation requirement in July, 5 months of flying. I was exhausted, Mitchell later wrote. By my final missions, I was making mistakes that would have killed me in earlier months. I survived through luck, not skill. The weather reporting system, or rather lack of system, revealed the same philosophy. The India-China wing operated with minimal meteorological capability. The weather forecasts relied on single observations from departure airfields. Conditions over the Santsung Range could only be determined by aircraft already committed to the crossing. Pilots flew into unknown conditions because mission requirements didn't allow delays for weather reconnaissance. The navigation aids that existed in 1943-1944, radio direction finding, radio ranges, instrument landing systems, were not installed along the hump route. The cost of installation and maintenance in remote Indian and Chinese locations was deemed excessive relative to benefit. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning, using compass headings and calculated wind drift, with no electronic confirmation of position. This guaranteed that pilots encountering instrument conditions, clouds, darkness, snow, would occasionally become lost and fly until fuel exhaustion. The rescue capability was minimal until July 1943, when Captain John Blackie Porter established the first search and rescue unit. Prior to Porter's unit, downed airmen relied on local villagers or walked out through hostile territory unaided. Even after Porter's unit became operational, rescue required days or weeks of jungle travel. The philosophy was implicit. Rescue was desirable, but not essential. Pilots who crashed were largely on their own. Every system, every policy, every operational choice reflected the same calculation. Tonnage delivery justified any risk. The operation would succeed regardless of casualties. But this philosophy depended on a critical assumption: that sufficient replacement pilots and aircraft would be available to replace losses. And by late 1944, that assumption was failing. The consequences of operating transport aircraft beyond safe limits accumulated month by month, mission by mission, casualty by casualty, until the numbers became almost incomprehensible. February 1944 brought 13 aircraft destroyed and 28 crewmen killed. March 1944, 19 aircraft, 36 dead. April 1944, 16 aircraft, 31 dead. May 1944, 21 aircraft, 42 dead. June 1944, 18 aircraft, 34 dead. The pattern repeated through every month of 1944. July saw 23 aircraft destroyed. August brought 27. September, 28. October, 31. November, 29. December, 35 aircraft destroyed, 67 crewmen killed. The mathematics of attrition were relentless. From January 1944 through December 1944, Hump operations destroyed 271 aircraft and killed 531 crewmen, more casualties than many ground combat operations. And these numbers only counted aircraft totally destroyed. Many more suffered damage requiring extensive repair. The casualty reports accumulated in files at Air Transport Command Headquarters. Each entry followed standard format: aircraft type, serial number, pilot name and rank, crew names, mission number, departure time, last known position, casualties. The entries became numbingly routine. C-46 4477234, Captain Ronald Davis, crew of 4. Mission 87 from Chabua. Departed 0640 hours. Turbulence-induced structural failure at 1247 hours. Crash site located at coordinates 25.7 N, 98.4 E. All aboard killed. C-47 4223956. Lieutenant Paul Johnson. Crew of 3, 2 passengers. Mission 134 from Jorhat. Departed 1820 hours. Last radio contact 2047 hours, reporting fuel state critical. Aircraft never arrived. Kunming. No wreckage found. All declared missing, presumed dead. C-46 4478891. First Lieutenant Thomas Reynolds. Crew of 5. Mission 156 from Sukherating. Departed 1155 hours. Fuel system fire at 1334 hours. Aircraft exploded mid-air. Ground observers confirmed no survivors. Behind each entry was a human story. Captain Davis was 24 years old, married, expecting his first child. Lieutenant Johnson had survived 133 previous missions and was 3 weeks from rotation. Lieutenant Reynolds was writing a letter to his mother when the fuel system fire started. The specific incidents revealed the systematic nature of the danger. On March 15, 1944, C-46 4477445 departed Chabua at 0820 hours with a full load of aviation gasoline, 10,000 pounds in 55-gallon drums. At 09:43 hours, pilot Captain James Harrison radioed, "Fuel leak detected, strong gasoline odor in cockpit." At 09:44 hours, attempting emergency landing. At 09:45 hours, ground stations received no further transmission. Search aircraft found the wreckage 30 miles south of the Santsung Range, completely burned. The investigation concluded fuel leak ignited, probably from electrical spark, creating fireball that consumed the aircraft in seconds. Harrison and his four-man crew had no time to bail out. The C-46 fuel system continued killing crews throughout 1944 despite multiple modification attempts. Curtiss-Wright engineers developed improved fuel line seals in May 1944. Implementation required grounding each aircraft for 40 hours of maintenance. The India-China wing couldn't spare 40 hours per aircraft without missing tonnage targets. The modification was implemented gradually as aircraft cycled through depot maintenance, meaning many C-46s flew for months with known dangerous fuel systems because mission requirements couldn't accommodate safety groundings. Lieutenant William Foster flew C-46s from June through September 1944. His diary entries tracked the progression. June 18th, another C-46 exploded today. They say it's the fuel system. We all know. We fly anyway. June 29, lost Jimmy Patterson, fuel fire. He was a good pilot. July 14th, can smell gasoline in the cockpit on every flight now. Try not to think about it. August 2, my C-46 caught fire on landing today. Got out in time. They'll have it flying again tomorrow. August 19th, Henderson gone. Fuel explosion. That's 6 pilots from my squadron since June. Foster survived his rotation in September 1944. Henderson, Patterson, and 4 others from Foster's squadron did not. The ice-related casualties followed similar patterns. C-47-42-23956, piloted Lieutenant Robert Mason, departed Jorhat on January 12, 1944 at 18:30 hours. At 18:05 hours, Mason radioed, "Encountering severe icing. Ice accumulation approximately 4 inches on wing leading edge. Airspeed decreasing." At 18:12 hours, "Unable to maintain altitude, descending through 13,000 feet." At 18:15 hours, "Breaking out of clouds at 9,000 feet, position uncertain, visibility 0. No further transmissions received." Wreckage found February 3, 1944 in Naga territory, 85 miles off course. Mason had apparently become lost descending through clouds to escape icing and flown until fuel exhaustion. All 3 crew members died in the crash. The weather-related losses peaked during monsoon season, May through October, when sustained heavy clouds, 0 visibility, and extreme turbulence made every mission hazardous. June 1944 alone saw 43 flights return to departure base without crossing the hump due to weather. But commanders pressured pilots to complete missions, and pressure led to calculated risks that frequently ended in disaster. On July 8, 1944, 6 C-46s departed Shabua in formation between 1400 and 1420 hours. Weather briefing warned of severe thunderstorms over the route. Formation leader Captain Edward Wilkins decided weather was marginal but acceptable. At 15:45 hours, all 6 aircraft encountered massive thunderstorm cell. The turbulence scattered the formation. 2 aircraft, piloted by experienced pilots, diverted south, avoiding the worst turbulence. 3 aircraft fought through and reached Kunming, damaged but intact. The 6th aircraft, C-46 44-78234, piloted by Lieutenant Charles Morrison, disappeared. No distress call, no wreckage found. Morrison and his 4-man crew simply vanished. The investigations concluded Lieutenant Morrison likely encountered turbulence exceeding aircraft structural limits, resulting in mid-air breakup. Formation leader Captain Wilkins used poor judgment launching mission into forecast severe weather. However, tonnage requirements necessitate accepting marginal conditions. Recommend no disciplinary action. The investigation's conclusion exemplified operational reality. Commanders acknowledged poor judgment but took no action because mission requirements demanded risks. Pilots understood the implicit message: fly the missions or be replaced by pilots who would. The Japanese fighter attacks resuming in November 1943 added another dimension to the casualty list. Between November 1943 and August 1945, Japanese fighters destroyed at least 34 transport aircraft and killed approximately 90 crewmen in aerial combat. The actual numbers were higher. Some aircraft listed as cause unknown were likely fighter victims. The worst single fighter engagement occurred on April 12, 1944. 14 C-46s approached Kunming at approximately 14:20 hours in loose formation at 18,000 feet. Japanese intelligence monitoring Allied radio frequencies had detected the formation and scrambled 24 Ki-43 Oscar fighters from Mite-Kiyina airfield. The fighters intercepted at 14:37 hours. The attack lasted approximately 15 minutes. The C-46s, loaded with ammunition and gasoline, exploded when hit. Captain Thomas Wright, piloting one of the C-46s that survived, described the massacre. "They came from above and behind, diving through our formation. The first C-46 exploded immediately, just a fireball where an airplane had been. Then two more. We scattered. I dove for clouds, watching tracers pass overhead. Counted 7 C-46s going down. Some exploding, some burning, some just falling. Parachutes from maybe 2 aircraft. Most crews never got out. The final count: 7 C-46s destroyed, 21 crewmen killed, 3 severely wounded. The Japanese lost 2 fighters. The Air Transport Command's response was to route formations farther north, beyond effective Japanese fighter range. But this added 90 miles to each mission, increasing fuel consumption, reducing payload, and exposing aircraft to worse weather over higher terrain. The casualties simply shifted from fighters to weather and mountains. By mid-1944, pilot morale had deteriorated significantly. Letters home, censored but preserved, revealed the psychological toll. "We lost another crew today. That's 5 this week. Nobody talks about it. We just mark them down and keep flying." Lieutenant James Morrison, June 1944. "I've stopped counting missions. Counting makes you think about the odds. Better just to fly and not think." Captain Robert Davis, July 1944. "Heard a mayday last night. Guy was lost, iced up, running out of fuel. We all listened to him die. What else could we do? Nobody could reach him. He just talked until the radio went dead." First Lieutenant Paul Henderson, August 1944. The psychological pressure of sustained danger with no respite created casualties even among pilots who survived. Captain Douglas Mitchell, completing his 750-hour rotation in July 1944, suffered what modern medicine would diagnose as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. His final flight report stated, "I can't do this anymore. I watch ice forming and think I'm going to die. I hear engines cough and think I'm going to die. I see clouds and think I'm going to die. Every mission for 5 months, I thought I was going to die. I don't know how I didn't." Mitchell was quietly transferred to administrative duties in India and never flew again. The India-China wing attempted to address morale through various means: better food, improved quarters, recreational facilities, rest leaves. These helped marginally but couldn't address the fundamental problem: Pilots were flying missions that killed 4% of crews annually, with no realistic way to reduce the danger without reducing tonnage. And tonnage requirements continued increasing. By December 1944, the cumulative toll reached catastrophic levels. Since May 1942, the Hump operation had destroyed approximately 450 aircraft and killed approximately 1,000 crewmen. These numbers exceeded U.S. casualties in many ground combat operations. The Battle of Tarawa, one of the bloodiest Pacific battles, killed 1,009 Marines over 3 days in November 1943. The Hump operation killed comparable numbers over 30 months of sustained operations, making it, by any measure, one of the deadliest campaigns in the Pacific theater. Yet the operation continued expanding. December 1944 deliveries reached 34,914 tons. January 1945, 44,098 tons. February 1945, 46,545 tons. Each increase came at direct cost in aircraft and lives. The January 6-7, 1945 disaster, 15 aircraft destroyed in 24 hours, momentarily shocked commanders into reconsidering the operation's sustainability. General Tunner, writing to Air Transport Command Headquarters, stated, "Current loss rates are unsustainable. We are destroying aircraft faster than replacements arrive. Pilot replacement rate lags attrition by approximately 15%. If current trends continue, the India-China wing will be unable to maintain operations by June 1945. But Tunner's dire prediction was overtaken by events. In February 1945, U.S. forces captured Lashio, Burma, reopening the Burma Road for the first time since March 1942. Ground convoy supply to China became possible again. The Hump operation, while continuing, was no longer China's only lifeline. The strategic pressure eased slightly. Mission requirements stabilized rather than continuing to increase. Pilot rotation policies were enforced more strictly. Aircraft maintenance standards improved as urgency decreased. But the dying continued. March 1945 brought 18 aircraft destroyed. April saw 22. May, 16. June, 14. July, 12. The operation continued until November 1945, 4 months after Japan's surrender in August, as the India-China wing transported occupation forces and equipment. The final Hump mission flew on November 15, 1945, exactly 3 years after the first Japanese fighter attack. The consequences, measured in cold statistics, were staggering. But statistics couldn't capture the reality of what those numbers meant. Thousands of young men, most in their early 20s, dying in remote mountain crashes, in burning aircraft, in jungle valleys where their bodies were never recovered, because strategic necessity demanded their sacrifice. The final statistics of the Hump operation, compiled from Air Transport Command records and post-war analysis, revealed the full scope of the sacrifice. Aircraft losses. Total aircraft destroyed between 594 and 609. Records vary. C-47 Skytrain, approximately 163 destroyed. C-46 Commando, approximately 345 destroyed. C-54 Skymaster, approximately 13 destroyed. C-87 Liberator Express, approximately 28 destroyed. C-109 tanker variant, approximately 7 destroyed. Various other types, approximately 38 destroyed. The variance in total numbers reflected the chaos of wartime record-keeping. Some aircraft listed as damaged beyond repair were not counted as combat losses. Some aircraft that disappeared without trace were listed as missing rather than destroyed until crews were declared dead months later. The most reliable estimates place total aircraft losses at 594. Aircrew casualties. Total deaths, 1,314 crewmen confirmed killed. Missing presumed dead, 345 additional crewmen. Walked out after crashes or bailouts, approximately 1,171 crewmen. Wounded or injured, incomplete records, estimated 800 plus. The casualty figures represented approximately 18% of all personnel who flew hump operations, meaning nearly 1 in 5 men who flew the hump either died, went missing, or survived crash bailout. For comparison, U.S. 8th Air Force bomber crews over Europe suffered approximately 10% casualty rates. Tonnage delivered. Total cargo delivered to China, 650,000 tons. Peak monthly delivery, 71,042 tons, July 1945. Total missions flown, approximately 167,285. Average payload per mission, 3.9 tons. The tonnage figures, impressive in scale, obscured brutal efficiency calculations. Each ton delivered cost 0.91 aircraft destroyed and 2.02 crewmen killed or missing. The hump operation delivered cargo at human cost exceeding most combat operations. Aircraft specifications and comparative analysis. The C-47 Skytrain represented the most reliable aircraft on the hump but carried the smallest payload at required altitude. Maximum takeoff weight, 26,000 pounds. Payload at 15,000 feet, 4,000 pounds. Service ceiling, 24,000 feet. Range, 1,600 miles. Engines, 2 Pratt & Whitney R1830, 1,200 horsepower each. Defensive armament, none. Crew protection, none. Loss rate, approximately 3.2% of C-47s deployed destroyed. The C-46 Commando carried superior payload but suffered catastrophic fuel system design. Maximum takeoff weight, 45,000 pounds. Payload at 25,000 feet, 10,000 pounds. Service ceiling, 27,000 feet. Range, 1,200 miles. Engines, 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800, 2,000 horsepower each. Defensive armament, optional, .50 door gun, late war. Crew protection, none. Loss rate, approximately 4.8% of C-46s deployed destroyed. Specific defect, fuel lines through wing root leaked, pooled fuel in fuselage, ignited catastrophically. The C-54 Skymaster, arriving late in the operation, provided best performance. Maximum takeoff weight, 73,000 pounds. Payload at 25,000 feet, 20,000 pounds. Service ceiling, 22,000 feet. Range, 3,900 miles. Engines, 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000, 1,450 horsepower each. Defensive armament, none. Crew protection, none. Loss rate, approximately 1.1% of C-54s deployed destroyed. The C-54's superior safety record reflected better engineering, redundant systems, 4 engines instead of 2, and arrival late in operation when procedures had improved. But C-54s remained scarce. Only 332 were ever assigned to hump operations compared to over 1,000 C-46s. Comparative analysis, Allied versus Axis philosophy. The fundamental difference between American and Japanese/German transport operations was crew protection philosophy. American transport aircraft, while unarmored and unarmed, were designed with crew survivability as priority. Multiple engines provided redundancy. Robust flight control systems allowed survival after battle damage. Spacious cockpits allowed crew bailout. But these features added weight. A C-47 Skytrain weighed 16,970 pounds empty. A comparable German U-52/3M weighed 14,330 pounds empty, 2,640 pounds lighter despite similar dimensions. The weight difference represented crew protection systems, stronger structures, and safety redundancies. The Japanese approach prioritized mission capability over crew survival. The Ki-57 transport, comparable to the C-47, weighed only 13,230 pounds empty, 3,700 pounds lighter than the C-47. The weight savings allowed greater payload or range, but left crews vulnerable to any mechanical failure or combat damage. The hump operation revealed an uncomfortable truth. American transport aircraft philosophy assumed operating environments with emergency landing fields, rescue capability, and minimal combat exposure. The Himalayas provided none of these. American crews died in aircraft designed for safety margins that didn't exist over the hump route. The human cost beyond statistics. The 1,314 confirmed dead and 345 missing represented permanent scars on families and communities across America. Captain Robert Davis's wife received notification of his death on March 15, 1944, 2 weeks before their daughter was born. Lieutenant Paul Johnson's parents received a telegram stating he was missing in action in January 1944. He wasn't officially declared dead until January 1945, leaving them in agonizing uncertainty for a year. Captain John Blackie Porter's search and rescue unit walked out 1,117 survivors, but the psychological toll on rescued crews was severe. Lieutenant James Morrison, who bailed out over Naga territory in June 1944 and walked 17 days to reach safety, later wrote, "I survived physically. I didn't survive mentally. I dream about that bailout every night. I wake up hanging in my parachute harness in the trees, watching my plane burn on the valley floor below. I survived, but 23 men from my squadron didn't. Why did I survive and they didn't?" The survivors' guilt affected many hump veterans. They had witnessed friends die, heard final radio calls from doomed crews, and continued flying knowing their odds of survival decreased with every mission. The psychological trauma remained largely untreated. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized until decades later. CBS correspondent Eric Severade, rescued by Porter's unit after bailing out in August 1943, wrote extensively about his 17-day jungle ordeal. But Severade's celebrity survival story overshadowed the thousands of similar ordeals by unknown crews who walked out with no publicity. Severade survived. Countless others didn't. Their names are recorded in casualty reports, but forgotten by history. The command responsibility. General William Tunner, commanding India-China Wing during the operation's bloodiest period, later defended the casualty rates. "We were given an impossible mission and told to make it work. We did make it work. The cost was high, but the alternative, losing China as an ally, was strategically unacceptable. Every pilot who flew the hump was a volunteer. They knew the dangers. They flew anyway because they believed China's survival mattered." Tunner's defense contained truth but overlooked uncomfortable realities. Pilots were technically volunteers for the Army Air Forces, but once assigned to hump operations, they had no choice but to fly assigned missions or face court-martial for refusing orders. The volunteer designation provided legal and moral cover for sending men into conditions that violated every aviation safety principle. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, understood the operation's brutal calculus. His statement that the hump was bleeding us white in transport aircraft acknowledged the unsustainable attrition. But Marshall, like Tunner, concluded strategic necessity justified the cost. The philosophical question remained: did keeping China in the war justify 1,314 American deaths plus 594 aircraft destroyed? Post-war analysis suggested China's contribution to Japan's defeat was marginal. Japanese forces in China never seriously threatened Japanese home islands. The decisive campaigns occurred in the Pacific Island hopping offensive and the Philippines. China tied down approximately 1 million Japanese soldiers, but those soldiers were not Japan's best equipped or best trained divisions. Historians still debate whether the Hump operation's strategic value justified its cost. What isn't debated: the young men who flew the Hump paid the price for strategic decisions made by commanders who never crossed the Himalayas themselves. Legacy and lessons. The Hump operation proved that sustained military airlift was possible under the worst conditions imaginable, if commanders were willing to accept catastrophic casualty rates. The operation pioneered techniques that later enabled the Berlin airlift 1948 to 1949, the Korean War airlifts, and modern military logistics operations. General Tunner, applying lessons learned on the Hump, commanded the Berlin airlift with dramatically better safety records: 31 deaths over 15 months, delivering 2.3 million tons, compared to Hump's 1,314 deaths, delivering 650,000 tons. The improvement reflected better aircraft, C-54s instead of C-46s, better weather, shorter distances, and established airfields. Everything the Hump lacked. The operation's final lesson was philosophical. Strategic necessity can justify almost any sacrifice in wartime. The young men who flew the Hump died because commanders decided their lives were worth less than keeping China supplied. Whether that decision was right or wrong depends on whether one values strategic abstraction over human life. The 1,314 confirmed dead had no choice in that calculation. They flew because they were ordered to fly. They died in mountains, in burning aircraft, in jungle valleys, believing their sacrifice mattered. History has largely forgotten their names. The examination of casualty reports at Air Transport Command Headquarters in March 1946 provided final proof of what operational commanders had known since 1942. The Hump operation succeeded not through brilliant strategy or superior technology, but through sheer willingness to absorb losses that peacetime aviation would never accept. The report compiled by Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson, assigned to analyze the operation's costs and lessons, stated plainly: the India-China airlift achieved its strategic objective of keeping China supplied and in the war. It did so at a cost of 594 aircraft destroyed and 1,314 airmen killed, casualty rates exceeding many frontline combat operations. These casualties were not primarily caused by enemy action. They were caused by operating aircraft beyond design limits, through hostile weather, over impossible terrain, with inadequate navigation aids, minimal rescue capability, and pilot exhaustion from excessive flight hours. Thompson's report noted the bitter irony. The operation's worst month for casualties, January 1945, occurred simultaneously with its greatest strategic irrelevance. U.S. forces captured Lashio, Burma in February 1945, reopening the Burma Road. The Hump operation, which had cost hundreds of lives monthly for 33 months, became partially obsolete 1 month after its bloodiest disaster. The aircraft that flew the final Hump mission on November 15, 1945, a C-54 Skymasters serial number 42-7201, represented everything the operation should have been from the beginning. Reliable 4-engine aircraft, robust systems, adequate payload at required altitude. Had the entire operation been flown with C-54s, casualty rates would have been dramatically lower. But C-54s weren't available in 1942. The operation launched with inadequate aircraft because strategic necessity demanded immediate action. The Hump veterans returned to America largely unrecognized. Unlike bomber crews or fighter pilots, transport pilots received no combat recognition. No distinguished flying crosses for flying through conditions that killed thousands. No publicity for their sacrifices. They had simply done their jobs, and their jobs had killed 1,314 of their colleagues. Captain Douglas Mitchell, who survived his Hump rotation in July 1944, later reflected, "We weren't heroes. We were just transport pilots doing an impossible mission. The real heroes were the guys who didn't come back. The crews who died in mountains nobody had heard of, delivering cargo to places nobody cared about for a strategy nobody was sure made sense. They died believing it mattered. Maybe it did. I'll never know." The operation's legacy lived on in modern military airlift doctrine. Every sustained airlift operation since, Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, drew lessons from the Hump. The primary lesson, logistics operations require the same planning, resources, and respect given to combat operations. The secondary lesson, inadequate aircraft, exhausted pilots, and minimal safety margins guarantee casualties. But the deepest lesson was philosophical. The Hump operation demonstrated that in total war, strategic necessity justifies almost any sacrifice. Young men were sent to die, not fighting enemy forces, but fighting weather, mountains, and physics, because keeping China supplied served grand strategy that few of them understood and fewer still survived to question. The 1,314 confirmed dead of the Hump operation rest in military cemeteries across America, China, India, and Burma. Their graves bear standard military markers, noting their service. Few markers mention the specific operation that killed them. Most Americans who visit those graves have never heard of the Hump. The final accounting is this. Between May 1942 and November 1945, the United States Army Air Forces operated the most dangerous supply line in military history. It delivered 650,000 tons of cargo to China at a cost of 594 aircraft and 1,300 American lives. It proved that sustained military airlift was possible under impossible conditions. And it proved that strategic necessity, once accepted, can justify sacrifices that seem unconscionable. The Hump operation was not poorly planned. It was deliberately planned to accept catastrophic casualties because commanders decided China's resistance to Japan was worth any price in American pilots and aircraft. That decision kept China fighting until Japan's surrender in August 1945. Whether that decision was right or wrong, the 1,300 young men who died over the Himalayas paid the price for it. Their sacrifice succeeded in its strategic objective.
And in succeeding, it demonstrated a truth that remains relevant to modern military operations. Some missions can only be accomplished by accepting losses that seem impossible to justify, yet without which entire theaters of war would collapse. The Hump veterans who survived, the men who flew 2,000 hours annually through lethal weather, who watched friends die, who heard final radio calls from doomed crews, who walked out of jungle after bailouts, returned home knowing a truth that America preferred to forget. The United States won World War II not just through superior technology and industrial might, but through willingness to sacrifice lives in operations the public never knew existed. The Hump Airlift stands as testament to both the extraordinary capability of determined airmen and the extraordinary cost of strategic necessity. The young men who flew it deserved better aircraft, better conditions, better odds. They deserved recognition for facing dangers that exceeded most combat operations. They deserved to be remembered. Most of all, they deserved to survive. 1,714 of them did not, and in their deaths lies the entire story of how America kept China fighting and what that cost means about the nature of total war.